Uh, B asked me to talk with you all about public education. This is a perennial issue that you are interested in. It is a perennial issue that's part of your legislative program, and that makes a lot of sense. It makes sense certainly from the standpoint of the intrinsic value of public education to the children and the families of Texas. It makes sense in the context that I think that public education is one of the important community binders of the Texas culture and society. That common experience of public education that a lot of us, not all of us obviously, but a lot of people have, sort of informs the way we're in community with one another. As Josh indicated in the pre-introductory remarks, we spend a lot of money on public education. It's a constitutional requirement that the Texas legislature provides for the general dissemination of knowledge. We interpret that to mean public education. We interpret that to mean a system of public ed that takes all comers. And in the later years of our state, we have interpreted that to mean things like equal access and people going to school together, and a progressive effort to make sure that schools have funding that is at least similar to their fellow schools in maybe richer socioeconomic areas. We call this school equity. The people who are in favor of it call it Robin Hood, and the people who hate it call it Robin Hood. It's quite a sometimes controversial concept, but nevertheless, we generally feel like it's important to equalize the access to a quality public education. Let me start by talking a little bit about where we are right now in the upcoming legislative session. And to do that, we have to reach back and talk a little bit about the previous session. As you all may recall, in the previous legislative session, there was a significant bill. You will hear this referred to in public discussions as House Bill 3. House Bill 3 was the brainchild of the leadership of the legislature in concert with a lot of different public education groups. At the beginning of the 2019 legislative session, the leadership in the state, that is the lieutenant governor, the governor, and the speaker of the House, signaled that they understood that there were a lot of important financial strains on public education, and that they wanted to do something that is a fairly rare step in Texas. And that was that they wanted to do something of a finance reform for public education at a time when they were not being told that they had to do so with a lawsuit. For several decades now, Texas public education finance reform has been driven by a court finding that our system is not constitutional. You all may remember the Edgewood cases in the 1990s. You may remember the West Orange Cove cases in the 2000s. We have had this chronic problem with the funding of public education, and the two issues embedded, well, there are three issues really embedded in the funding for pub ed. One is it sufficient to do the job? That is there enough money to actually ensure that kids are getting educated? Number two is the funding reasonably equitable? That is that gross amount of funding reaching all of the kids in Texas to satisfy the constitutional requirement of a general diffusion of knowledge? That is, everybody's got to have a good, clean shot at it. And then the third issue is, how does the way we fund, is the way we fund public education actually constitutional? We do a lot of our funding for pub ed out of property taxes. And there are questions related to whether or not a property tax, if it's fully dedicated to the core funding of PubEd, and there's no local discretion about how to use local property taxes, is that constitutional, or does it violate a constitutional prohibition against a statewide property tax? Those are the things. That sounds a little esoteric, but again, I know you all have been wrestling with this issue for years and years, and most of you are actually quite familiar with what I'm talking about. But those are the issues that sort of drive the conversation in public education and public education funding. Again, during the last session, we knew that we were getting into the space of strain once again, that we were getting close to the limit on taxation. We were getting close to triggering some court issues with regard to equity and basic adequacy in terms of the amount of money in PubEd. And so the legislature, in an unusual moment of clarity, at least historically — I don't mean that as a pejorative, I just mean that as a citation of the history of this subject — said, let's do a PubEd funding bill, a pretty big one, without having a court telling us that we have to do it. That's great. They went through, and it was sort of a hard-fought piece of legislation. Lots of stakeholders, I mean, pretty much everybody in the state is worried about this for a variety of reasons, as described. The legislature was able to pass House Bill 3. The public education people that I work around and with were pretty happy with House Bill 3, but were pretty concerned because they said, all right, we're passing House Bill 3, and it has these fairly significant funding increases that are going to be helpful, and some governance structures that are going to be helpful for us. But we don't exactly know how they're going to pay for this in the future. We are concerned that this bill is being passed now and it looks pretty good, but when we come back next time, there's going to be insufficient money to actually pay for the ambitions of this bill. And that's where we left it. That's where we left it at 2019. There was going to be a bunch of study of the effects of House Bill 3 throughout 2020, and then we were going to roll into the 2021 session and say, oh, golly gee, do we have enough money to pay for this ambitious program? And then I think all of you know what happened. We rolled into 2019 immediately after the session, and we're sort of enveloped in an issue with the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House ultimately declared that he would no longer be running for election, which sort of threw the leadership space in the House into a period of flux, and sort of killed the preliminary conversation about most legislative things, including PubEd. And then around about the end of February, we got into COVID as a theory, and in March we got into COVID as a fact in Texas, and that threw everything into flux. That threw the study of public education and this study, the minute detailed study of House Bill 3, into flux. It also created a huge question about whether the state, notwithstanding what it owed on House Bill 3, whether the state would have enough money to do anything going forward. We had no idea what the economy was going to look like. We had no idea how tax revenue would be affected by what was happening in the economy as a result of the COVID pandemic. And so this past spring, summer, and into fall, those of us who work in public education have been quite worried about what we were moving toward financially. And like a good writer of the sort of epic novels that have a bunch of different characters and everything, that's a cliffhanger. So for just a second, I'm going to stop talking about the roll forward to finance. That's to be continued, because now we have to go back and talk about public education's own issues with and attempts to deal with the COVID crisis. So put a pin in the finance and let's go back and start talking about public ed and the COVID crisis. Public ed and the COVID crisis. In March, as you all may recall, COVID really got into Texas the last part of February, the first part of March. It coincided somewhat with the coming of spring break, which for most schools was in the second week of March. The Friday before spring break, Thursday afternoon, my wife, who is a public school teacher in Austin, Texas, was told, don't come in tomorrow. We're going to evaluate the situation during spring break. So take the Friday before spring break. We're closing down school like it's a snow day. Then we're going to kind of see what's happening because this is really confusing. We don't know what's going on. And then we're going to make a decision about whether to not come back in the week after spring break or not. And then we'll come back to school after that. And so Carlin came home and told me this, and I said, okay. And this was happening all over Texas with school districts all over the place. We didn't go anywhere for spring break. We sort of did our thing and hung out. And then the week after spring break came, and it was like a double long spring break. And then that week, Carlin was told, you're not coming back to school this school year. You have 30 minutes to go to your classroom and pick up whatever you need. And then we're shutting down the school and locking you out. That's how it happened with regard to public education. Those of you who were either kids yourself in high school, I'm hoping there's some young people here at the conference this time, or people who are wrangling kids at that time know exactly what I'm talking about. Those of you who are teachers, of course, know what I'm talking about. It was just really shocking. It was a drop right off the edge of the normal schedule, the normal activities of public education. And so that's what happened. Carlin and hundreds of thousands of other teachers went to school, collected what they might or might not need to do their job if it did not happen. Came home and said, okay, now what do we do? From that point in time, from that middle of March forward into the summer and then rolling into the new school year, public educators all over Texas, administration, faculty members, support people, everybody else in Texas, they've been struggling to really figure out how to do their job. I can say both anecdotally and systemically. Anecdotally, because I'm related, starting with my wife, to lots of school teachers. And systemically, because I work with the Texas Association of School Administrators, which are all the superintendents in the state. It would be wrong for me not to stop and say their efforts have been nothing short of heroic, period. The energy with which they have gone into a situation that was just absolute free fall in terms of anything that they've ever experienced before. And figured out how teachers could get in touch with students and check in with them, figure out how to finish out the school year and make really big, important policy decisions about grades and class rank in high schools and about what they would do and how they would respond to this pandemic. Come up with a work system for the summer to try to get a new school year launched, and then come into this new school year and provide both virtual synchronous learning, asynchronous learning, and dangerous and heroic in-person learning at schools all over Texas. It's just absolutely astounding. It was an astounding effort by public education to do their work. And I think it would be wrong for any two or more people gathered in Texas not to pause and consider that. I will also tell you that in this age of sort of consumerism, I guess, that's an issue that we all deal with. School teachers and school administrators have gotten an enormous amount of negative energy coming at them. In the very same breath or weeks, they have been told, how dare you have kids back in school, and how dare you not have kids back in school? How dare you try to teach my kid on a computer? How dare you not have a fully computerized system of learning already ready to go? And they have been dealing with just an enormous amount of pushback from the public, who has rightly pointed out when they've come up short, but not really treated the system. Some people have not treated the system with a huge amount of grace in trying to deal with this really difficult situation. Okay, I'm finished honking right there for public education. I think that they have done a job that's just absolutely phenomenal. I think that there have been lots of balls dropped and lots of balls picked back up, and it's a chaotic situation where everybody's doing their best. But I guess what I would ask this group, many of you whom are either public educators or former public educators, to pause for a minute and keep these folks in your prayers, and tell them thanks if you get the chance, because they continue to operate under a tremendous amount of pressure. So in addition to having to deal with those actual like hands-on pieces of how to educate kids and finding all these children and making sure they're called and they get re-engaged in school, even if they're not on campus. The other thing that public education has had to deal with in Texas is the peculiarly physical way in which we fund public education. The big way that we fund pub ed here is by something called average daily attendance. That schools get funded for daily attendance per student that has actually been broken down into minute attendance per student in parts of the public education funding formula. Well, what constitutes daily attendance if you're teaching virtually? This is something new. And if you are a school where the state of Texas, who's very anxious to return to normal life, says all the schools have to be open to in-person education, which has been the order that's come down through the Texas Education Agency since the beginning of this school year in September. If you can't do that responsibly, or if you're in a community where there are issues, or if your school board or your individual principals say, we don't feel like it's safe here for my staff, for my students to be here, and you decide that you're not going to be offering in-person education for anybody who shows up physically at the school, is there a penalty for that from the TEA, from the Texas Education Agency, in terms of recognition of those hours, recognition of that attendance for funding? And the answer is yes. That has been a very difficult issue during the pandemic. I will give you an example. The week before Thanksgiving, Austin Independent School District said, we've really got this big community spread that Austin declared a state of emergency. And the Austin Independent School District said, we're not going to do in-person this week. They subsequently were informed by TEA, or it was inferred by TEA, that because they hadn't done in-person instruction, they weren't going to get paid for that week by the state and its obligation to pay for contact hours. Subsequently, the administration of the school district said, well, we've got to figure out how to make that week up to get paid, in essence, asking their faculty and staff to work a whole extra week, like an hour a day for a few weeks, or come in on Saturdays, or there were all kinds of ideas floated about how to make this week up. Work an extra week for the same amount of pay to get makeup funding from TEA for that week that they told everybody to stay home because they were worried about infections. this is the kind of issue that school districts all over the state have been going through in terms of funding. So in the context of funding, you remember when I asked you all to put a pin in the funding issue that we were talking about, the big House Bill 3 and coming into the session funding issue. Funding is the issue of funding is happening on two different levels during the pandemic. The normal accounting of funding, that is how much money each school gets as they're trying to soldier through this pandemic and do absolutely strike the community balance between the public health and safety, public health of the community and the safety of their staff and children, versus the ambitions of the state to be open for business and the funding requirements that the state is asserting on schools to be able to get their normal budgetary budget payments. And then there is this macro issue, which is heading toward this legislative session. What will funding look like? And so that is where we are with regard to the funding of public education. So given the punchline and the cliffhanger, put a pin in it, here's what we found out. This past week, the House and the Senate both released their budgets, and get ready to be surprised and flustered by what I'm about to tell you. Both the Senate and the House pretty much fully funded public education, including the increases that were present in House Bill 3. Again, they're funding their commitment to House Bill 3. I'm going to pause there for a second and just let everybody sort of soak in that, because not that I'm a cynic, but I was as surprised as anybody that in a budget year where we're likely to have some fairly substantial cuts, even though we're a little bit better off than we thought we would be in the overall budget in Texas, the public ed community, when we saw those draft budgets come out, just said, that's weird. That's not a fight that we're going to have, is trying to get a little enrollment growth and somehow dig ourselves out of a hole. We are frankly surprised. So my first instruction with regard to talking to legislators about the funding concept so far in the upcoming legislative session, and of course by instruction to you all, I always mean humble request, because you all are the greatest grassroots group in the history of the world. And that is to say, good plan, legislature, carry through with it. If you're talking to legislative members or staff, say, I think it is an appropriate thing to say, we have noted that you are funding public education fully in both budgets. That's really great, and we're paying attention to that. And thank you for that preliminary consideration. Please hold the line for the rest of the legislative session. This is a good thing, and I think part of certainly what I think that part of the commitment of a good group of citizens is to complain when you need to complain, but to say we recognize an effort when your elected officials as a group are making an effort. And in this case, we think that they're making a very strong effort to honor commitments and to really try to fund public education. So I would encourage some positive commentary there. So we're going to be watching funding for the rest of the legislative session. The next thing that we're going to be watching is a little bit less of a really good story. Before we get there, let me say just a word about, this is sort of a big macro issue related to the state budget overall and how things work. And there's a little history here too, but I think it's relevant to public education. In 2009, there was a huge economic crisis ongoing. You all may recall that in 2008, we had a big finance meltdown in the United States. And in 2009, we were way short on our budget. But in 2009, the federal government passed a fairly substantial stimulus package. And we took that stimulus money and we filled in our state budget with federal dollars that were ad hoc dollars, that were dollars that were voted for that year to help states all over the country weather this financial crisis that had come from mortgage-backed securities. The result of that was that we had sort of an even go during the 2009 session, and then in 2011, we didn't have that federal stimulus money, and we had swept a lot of our financial problems under the rug. And 2011 was a super rough session for everybody, including public education. PubEd got funded in 2009. PubEd got slashed in 2011. We just this past year pretty much caught up to the funding levels per student and for enrollment growth and things like that from the cuts of 2011. And so we're very hopeful that 2021 is going to be a pretty good legislative session for us, funding-wise, as just enumerated. But we are certainly concerned about that ongoing commitment related to whether or not there is federal money in the future. And if we take pandemic money and we basically use that as a prop for our financial situation in Texas, and then in 2023 that prop is pulled out, some of our structures might collapse. So I couldn't get through a whole financial talk, I guess, without some sort of foreboding comment. Sorry about that, but I think it's important for us to look at, because to the extent that we're looking at sort of the bigger macro issues in Texas, like the way we do taxes and a fair and equitable tax policy, just because we have funding now, we shouldn't stop looking at the efficacy of those tax systems. I think that's an ongoing work for us, and we shouldn't just stop looking at that for a few years while we have some federal dollars, only to have it emerge again as a problem in the future. So hooray that it looks like there's a commitment or a plan at least to fund us for 2021, but let us use our time wisely between 21 and 23 and see if we can't get a better general funding system for the obligations of Texas. Okay, that's where we are with regard to funding. I'm going to pause right now. I just opened up the Q&A section in our technology here, and so let me take a quick look at the questions that are here. And most of these actually track with what we're talking about. There is one particular question here from Carolyn Smith about issues of charter school funding, and that is actually a great segue into the next part of our communication. Let me also talk a little bit about, got a question from Holly Gaskell Bandel, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who says she has heard the word tax compression related to HB3. Can you explain how this is working now and the potential problems? Tax compression is always part of the push and pull in Texas of funding for PubEd. There is a notion that our property taxes are too high, and I think that is a pretty easy thing to agree with, because the way we do property taxes is very hurtful for people on fixed incomes. It's very hurtful for people if we're in an economic downturn and they can't pay their property taxes. It's a driver of homelessness. It's a driver of gentrification and of the dissolution, the bad kind of gentrification, the dissolution of neighborhoods that suddenly become cool neighborhoods, and a lot of the people who have historically lived in them can't pay the taxes to keep living in them. We see this a lot in Austin. We see it in cities all over Texas. The tax compression is part of a typically a compromise in school funding, where you basically say we're going to have put new state money in, and in so doing reduce the local tax rate and have that compression rate sort of statutorily mandated. So if we're putting new state money in, we're not going to let the school districts stay at the same taxing level. And so you do a little dollar trading there. And then the legislature can say, we've addressed the problem, a real problem of property taxes, but we've also addressed a funding problem for public education. The problem in tax compression comes when you overemphasize the tax compression and you don't allow school districts to actually keep pace with their expenses. Another problem that happens with tax compression is that you take away the discretion of local communities to be able to raise and spend money in places that they see as necessary, as that they're seeing in their communities. And so it is Holly makes a good citation that when you're looking at any school finance proposal, you need to look at anything related to tax compression in it and ask the question, will that be a trap in the future? So far in House Bill 3, the compression rate in House Bill 3 is not crippling the financing that is in the bill. But it's also, and this is super important, school finance is never finished. It's always a work in progress. And one of the things you always have to be willing to do is go back and look at that compression rate and say, look, either we need to come up with a new funding source, a new kind of taxation in Texas, or you need to ease those compression rates in the taxes so that school districts are able to raise the money the only way they can, which is property taxes, to get what they need to fulfill their constitutional and community responsibilities. I hope, Ollie, I wish I was looking at you in a room somewhere so that I could see if you're saying, yes, you're answering my question, thumbs up or not. But I hope that's helpful in trying to look at and understand tax compression. The other question is that popped out at me was this charter school question, and we need to talk about that. And that actually moves us into a whole new category of discussion, which is you have the amount of money that is being given to public schools, and then you have the second question, which is all the money actually getting to public schools as we understand them in our community? And this goes to a really broad theme that's been more than 2 decades in Texas that is really that's really interesting, and something I know you all have wrestled with in policy terms as a policy body. And that is the publicness or privateness of school funding, and the issue of school choice, and the issues of privatization of public dollars in education. As you all know, during the 2000s, there was a very open conflict in the legislature and in the political communities in Texas about school vouchers. And this idea was you would take your tax dollars, and instead of just sending them to public schools, you would create this voucher that people with school children could use to either go to a public school or to pay a private school. And although we came close to passing a universal voucher system a time or two in the middle of the 2000s, ultimately the public pretty much rejected the pure voucher concept and said, that's just not something that we're ready to do. We think public money should go to public schools. This comports with the legislative program that you all tend to pass. You typically talk very explicitly as the UMW about public dollars going to public schools. Charter schools are a really weird animal in this, because charter schools are technically public schools. If you look at billboards around town, or if you look at the literature that charter schools, like the associations of charter schools, the people who do what I do, but for charter schools put out, they talk about public charter schools. And because they are in fact public schools, they are technically and statutorily charters authorized by the state of Texas, where public schools are operated in the public interest. What makes them a little bit different is that the charter school employees are typically not public employees. They're paid with public dollars, but charter schools are most often run by private corporations. Some of these are nonprofit corporations. Some of them are sort of umbrella corporations that do this kind of thing all over the country. And so you'll have these large charter school systems that come in, and they apply for and are granted state charters, and then they essentially provide contract services and have a public school that is being run by a private company, and the money from the public school dollars are being spent in that space and going to private interests. Now, one can argue that this happens with all kinds of things, because public schools themselves, Austin Independent School District or Victoria ISD or whomever, they take money and they pay it to private concerns for contract services, right? They build buildings with architects, or do all kinds of things contractually with private concerns. But it's a little bit different than the charter school concept that's sort of a wholesale provision of or contracting out of the public education service to a private corporation. I have a little brain trust of public education policy wonks that I deal with, and I actually was meeting with them on Friday, and I sent a note to them and said, I'm talking to this great grassroots fantastic group, the UMW, like I do every year. Is there anything that you all want me to highlight when I talk to the UMW? And the first thing that one of my people sent to me was tell them that between 2010 and 2020, Texas granted 797 charters for new charter schools. And if you look at the enrollment in those charter schools, that constitutes the creation of 6 Austin Independent School Districts. And those 6 Austin Independent School Districts that are operating as charter schools are duplicative of what we're doing in public education. There's not a dollar for dollar trade when a kid decides to go to a charter school, because there's so many fixed costs in public education. This person that I'm talking about is a very strong critic of the charter school system. And she considers this, and I tend to agree with her, that in many instances, this sort of competitive charter school system that we have in Texas is pretty much an outrage and is a pretty substantial diversion of public school money into private spaces. I'm saying this in a very measured and careful way because most education experts agree that there is a place for charter school mechanisms, and that there are ways that charter schools can be used to serve special needs population or fill in important spaces in the public education system, or come in and provide an alternative to a truly insufficient system in discrete areas. But as a wholesale parallel mechanism for educating, most of the same people that I'm talking about say that it's wasteful. It's just sort of a back end kind of privatization of public school dollars. And so that's an issue. Again, 797 new charter schools from 2010 to 2020. And the private schools have a very aggressive lobby effort, and they work hard and they brand hard, and the companies that own them devote significant resources to talking to the legislature, that is lobbying. And this is a thing that bears watching by every citizen in Texas. It has become weirdly easy to get a charter in Texas. And to the extent that you all have always asserted that public dollars should stay in public education and that we shouldn't privatize education money, charter schools continue to deserve a huge amount of scrutiny from us, because although they are technically public schools, in my opinion, the wholesale marketing of charter schools and use of charter schools in Texas, and the way that charter schools are operating in Texas, constitutes a substantial diversion of public money into private spaces at the expense of public schools. So I think that is a thing that we need to watch in the next legislative session. There will not likely be a really hard voucher push, at least anything that we would recognize clearly as a wholesale privatization of public money. But there are plenty of spaces that we need to watch really carefully about the diversion of public money into spaces that take them out of the traditional fabric of public schools in Texas, that we think is very, very important. Again, looking at what you all are asking, I've seen the letters TRS in about a bunch of your questions. And so let me stop and talk about TRS for a second. TRS is the Teacher Retirement System of Texas. It is an enormous retirement program in Texas with about $150 billion of assets under management. That is large by any measure. It's national. I think the only bigger public retirement system in the United States of America is CalPERS, which is the California system, but it is a combined system for defined benefit program retirement. TRS is probably every 2 years we do a substantial piece of legislation related to TRS. We will do so again in this legislative session. The teacher retirement system is under sunset review. So during the course of this last interim, TRS has been studied by the Sunset Commission, and there will be a bill, a sunset bill, that will reauthorize. It doesn't precisely reauthorize TRS because TRS is constitutional, but it will have a big impact on TRS operations and the way TRS is run. The other thing about sunset bills is that for those of you who are Star Wars fans, sunset bills become like what we call in the business the Death Star. They become these huge vehicles for every idea that everybody ever had about a question or topic. So we're quite concerned, not about anything in particular, but about the general danger of a sunset bill being in the legislature and what kind of amendments might be put on it that would affect TRS. The teacher retirement system does two really important things. One is it provides a percentage retirement structure for public educators and staff, public education employees. And so it basically, you pay into the system the whole time you're in, and when you get out, based on your years of service, you get a percentage of the highest of an average of years of your income for the rest of your life. It is a very important safety net style of retirement structure. So it's analogous somewhat to Social Security type benefits in that in its structure. It's not like a private retirement account that just has a pile of money in it and you can live off the interest, or if it's huge, or use that until it's gone. This is something that is paid by the state once you get your number fixed until you die. The There are some issues with those kinds of funds, in that if you retired 30 years ago, what seemed like a lot of money then may not seem like so much money now. But there's also the certainty of knowing how much money you're going to get per month on an ongoing basis, no matter how long you live. So TRS is important. The good news is that the teacher retirement system currently is pretty well funded. It's not fully funded actuarially, but it is within its statutory norms. And in general, the system has received pretty positive marks, both from Sunset and from an interim study review by the legislature. So the benefit structure, even notwithstanding the current problems in the stock market and the problems with the U.S. economy that are a result of COVID, the actual retirement system and retirement structure look like they're in pretty good shape. This is not an accident. This is just years and years of really good stakeholder process and lots of people working really hard to make sure that that system works. I think of TRS as a model for the way you do legislation and public policy, because lots of stakeholders get together at the table and hammer it out at very difficult work tables, and then go forward with policies that can then be embraced by the entire legislature. The last major reform of the TRS system, which was last session, passed unanimously in both the House and the Senate. Was not a news story because it got done right by all the stakeholders, and it wasn't passed unanimously because it was making, San Angelo the visual arts capital of Texas or whatever. It was passed unanimously as a substantive piece of policy because everybody did their work before it got to the floors. So that's good news. The other thing that TRS does for teachers, for a lot of you, and for public educators around the state, is it provides health benefits. It provides retired teacher health benefits, and it provides active teacher health benefits to some school districts. The health systems are really strained. Those of you who are retired teachers know that you've been fighting premium increases. Your fixed annuity does not increase, but your healthcare premiums do increase, and that is a net loss for you over time. And there have been lots of contributions into the healthcare system to try to offset those premium increases. But you are caught up in the general healthcare issue in the United States of the affordability of healthcare and how expensive it is here, and how the heck are we going to pay for it. The active care system, which is the for active school teachers, it is under strain as well. It's under strain because it has had to increase its premiums, and it's got some market in pressure. There are a lot of people in the healthcare marketplace that would like to get the business that TRS has and are trying to say we could provide healthcare for cheaper. And there's a lot of sort of complicated structural infighting is probably the right word. It sounds a little pejorative, but I think it's true. About companies coming in and saying school districts should not be required to be in TRS active care. They should be able to get out and buy our products if they want to. The problem with that is the impact it might have on the healthcare system itself, and it might create an unhealthy spiral in the TRS active care system that would really be destabilizing for those people who are relying on the public healthcare program. And so I think you all are right. I had not planned to talk about TRS today, but seeing all those letters on the right-hand side of my screen, I am glad you guys are paying attention to this, because it's very important. It's another thing that's never finished. It's something that has to be worked on every single session, and there will be significant legislation related to TRS on both the healthcare side and on the general structural governance side of TRS.